The first-class cabin fell into stunned silence as businessman Richard Thompson's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Keep your noise down, old man. Some of us are trying to work here." He snapped at the bearded passenger quietly strumming an acoustic guitar. What Richard didn't know was that the old man he'd just insulted was Dave Grohl, and the song he was quietly practicing was being prepared for the most heartbreaking performance of his entire career. Within minutes, Richard would discover his catastrophic mistake, and the truth would leave him wishing he could disappear into his first-class seat forever. But to understand how this confrontation erupted at 30,000 feet, we need to go back to that morning at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Dave Grohl sat in the departure lounge, his acoustic guitar case resting against his knee, his usual energetic demeanor replaced by something much more subdued. He'd been staring at his phone for the past 20 minutes, reading and rereading the same text message that had changed everything about this flight to Los Angeles. The message was from his longtime friend and mentor, Krist Novoselic, with news that had hit Dave like a physical blow. Their mutual friend and former bandmate from the early Seattle music scene, Marcus Rivera, had been given just days to live. Marcus had been battling cancer in private, refusing to let his condition become public knowledge. Now, with time running out, he had one final request. He wanted Dave to play their old song, Echoes of Tomorrow, at his bedside. Dave had written Echoes of Tomorrow with Marcus back in 1989, before Nirvana, before fame, when they were just two kids with guitars and dreams bigger than their broken amplifiers. The song had never been recorded professionally, never released, existing only in their memories and in a few grainy bootleg recordings from tiny Seattle clubs. Now Marcus wanted to hear it one more time before he passed away. The weight of the request had left Dave emotionally raw. Marcus wasn't just a friend, he was one of the people who had believed in Dave's talent before anyone else did. When Dave was struggling to find his place after Nirvana ended, Marcus had been there with encouragement and perspective. Now Dave was racing against time to fulfill what might be his friend's final wish, carrying his guitar because he wanted to practice the song during the flight. As Dave boarded the plane, he noticed the first-class cabin was nearly full with the usual mix of business travelers and well-dressed passengers. He settled into his window seat, grateful for the relative privacy and space to quietly work on the song. The melody had been haunting him all morning, bringing back memories of late nights in rehearsal spaces and the raw energy of their early performances together. Richard Thompson, a successful pharmaceutical executive in his 50s, had claimed the aisle seat across from Dave with the territorial confidence of someone accustomed to commanding space and attention. His laptop was already open, his phone buzzing with emails, and his entire demeanor suggested that this flight was simply an extension of his office. He glanced dismissively at Dave's casual clothing and guitar case, making assumptions about his fellow passengers' importance. Dave pulled out his phone and scrolled through old photos of Marcus, trying to prepare himself emotionally for what lay ahead. The images showed their younger selves on stage, laughing in recording studios, sharing the brotherhood that only comes from creating music together. Each photo felt like a punch to the chest, a reminder of how quickly life could change and how precious these connections really were. As the plane taxied toward takeoff, Dave carefully removed his acoustic guitar from its case, intending to quietly finger the chord progressions and hum the melody under his breath. Echoes of Tomorrow was a complex song emotionally, and he wanted to make sure he could perform it perfectly for Marcus. The song deserved to be played with all the love and memory it contained. The flight attendant, Susan Walsh, noticed Dave's guitar and approached with concern. "Sir, I'm not sure you can have that out during takeoff," she said politely. Dave looked up with tired eyes and explained quietly that he was traveling to see a dying friend and needed to practice a song for him. Something in his voice conveyed the urgency and grief behind the request, and Susan nodded with understanding. "Once we're at cruising altitude, you should be fine," Susan assured him quietly. "Just keep it low, and I'm sure the other passengers won't mind." She had been a flight attendant for 15 years and had developed an instinct for recognizing genuine human need versus mere convenience. Dave's request clearly fell into the former category, and she was willing to make reasonable accommodations for someone dealing with loss. 30 minutes into the flight, as the seatbelt sign dinged off, Dave carefully lifted his guitar onto his lap and began to quietly finger the opening chords of Echoes of Tomorrow. The song started with a gentle, melancholy progression that perfectly captured the bittersweet nature of memories and the passage of time. He kept his strumming barely audible, more focused on muscle memory than volume. Richard Thompson looked up from his laptop with immediate irritation. He'd been in the middle of reviewing quarterly sales reports when the soft guitar sounds began drifting across the aisle. His first instinct was annoyance at any disruption to his work routine. The sight of someone playing an instrument on an airplane struck him as inconsiderate and unprofessional, regardless of how quietly it was being done. "Excuse me," Richard said sharply, not bothering to modulate his voice for the confined space. "This is first class, not a coffee shop. Some of us are trying to conduct business here." His tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to having his demands met immediately. Several other passengers looked up at the commotion, surprised by the sudden tension in the typically quiet first-class cabin. Dave looked up from his guitar, surprised by the aggressive tone. "I'm sorry, I was trying to keep it very quiet," he said gently, his voice still carrying the emotional weight of the morning's news. "I'm practicing for someone who's dying, and I need to get this right." The vulnerability in his explanation was evident. A man dealing with grief trying to honor a friend's final request. Richard's expression hardened rather than softened at Dave's explanation. "Everyone has sob stories," he replied coldly. "That doesn't give you the right to disturb other passengers with your folk singer routine. This is a place of business, not your personal rehearsal space." His dismissal was cutting and public, designed to establish dominance and end the conversation on his terms. The cruelty of the response silenced the cabin. Other passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly disturbed by Richard's lack of empathy for someone dealing with loss. Susan, the flight attendant, had been approaching with coffee service, but stopped short when she heard the exchange. The contrast between Dave's gentle vulnerability and Richard's harsh aggression was stark and uncomfortable for everyone witnessing it. Dave felt the familiar surge of anger that had gotten him into trouble in his younger days, but Marcus's condition put everything in perspective. "I understand your point," Dave said quietly, placing his guitar back in its case. "I'll wait until I'm on the ground." His gracious response to Richard's cruelty demonstrated a maturity born from understanding what truly mattered in life versus what merely felt important in the moment. Richard returned to his laptop with satisfaction, feeling he had successfully established the proper boundaries for first-class behavior. He failed to notice the disapproving looks from other passengers, or the way Susan's professional smile had become notably cooler when she served his coffee. His victory felt complete, though he had no idea how short-lived that feeling would be. Dave spent the next hour staring out the window, silently fingering chord progressions on his leg while trying to keep his emotions in check. The song he needed to play for Marcus was running through his head on repeat, each mental rehearsal bringing back more memories of their friendship and shared musical journey. The urgency of getting to Los Angeles in time weighed heavily on his mind. Meanwhile, Richard continued working on his laptop, occasionally glancing over at Dave with continued disdain. In Richard's worldview, he had encountered exactly the type of entitled passenger he despised, someone who thought their personal drama gave them license to disturb others. The guitar case propped against Dave's seat served as a visual reminder of his successful assertion of first-class standards. Susan Walsh had been watching the interaction with growing concern. Something about the guitar player's demeanor suggested genuine grief rather than casual inconsideration. During her break, she decided to approach him quietly to check on his well-being. Years of customer service had taught her to recognize when someone was dealing with real crisis versus ordinary travel stress. "Are you doing okay?" Susan asked Dave quietly as she paused beside his seat. "I noticed you seemed pretty upset earlier, and I wanted to make sure you're all right." Her genuine concern was a stark contrast to Richard's hostility. reminding Dave that kindness still existed even in difficult moments. He looked up at her with grateful eyes. "My friend is dying," Dave said simply, his voice barely above a whisper to avoid disturbing other passengers. "I wrote a song with him 25 years ago, and he wants to hear it one more time. I was just trying to make sure I could play it right." The raw honesty of his explanation touched Susan deeply, confirming her instinct that this was about grief rather than inconsideration. Susan glanced toward Richard, who was still absorbed in his laptop, oblivious to the conversation happening nearby. "What's your friend's name?" she asked gently, settling into the empty middle seat to continue their quiet conversation. Her willingness to take time from her duties to offer comfort demonstrated the empathy that Richard had so conspicuously lacked earlier. "Marcus Rivera," Dave replied, and Susan could see the pain in his eyes as he said the name. "We played music together before either of us thought we'd make it anywhere. He's been fighting cancer, but he kept it private. Now he's got maybe 2 days left, and all he wants is to hear our old song." The time pressure added urgency to Dave's grief, making every moment of the flight feel precious. Susan had worked flights for celebrities before and was beginning to suspect there was more to Dave's story than met the eye, but she was more concerned with his emotional state than his identity. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said sincerely. "And I'm sorry about that passenger's behavior earlier. That was completely uncalled for, especially given what you're going through." Dave appreciated her kindness, but waved off concerns about Richard's behavior. "He doesn't know the situation," Dave said generously. "People react differently to things they don't understand." His ability to show compassion, even for someone who had treated him cruelly, demonstrated the character that had endeared him to millions of fans, though Susan still didn't know who he was. As their conversation continued, Susan learned more about Dave's relationship with Marcus and the significance of Echoes of Tomorrow in their shared history. The song represented their friendship, their dreams, and now their goodbye. Susan found herself moved by the depth of loyalty that would drive someone to cross the country just to play a song for a dying friend. Richard, still focused on his work, remained completely unaware of the conversation happening just feet away. His successful assertion of cabin authority had allowed him to return to his quarterly reports without further distraction. Occasionally he glanced over at Dave, noting with satisfaction that the guitar remained in its case where it belonged, confirming his belief that firm boundaries produced proper behavior. An hour before landing, Susan made an announcement over the cabin's intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have someone special on board today who's traveling to see a dear friend who's very ill. I know our passenger would be too modest to mention this himself, but he's actually Dave Grohl, the drummer from Nirvana and frontman of Foo Fighters, and he's rushing to play a song for his dying friend." The announcement hit the cabin like an electric shock. Passengers turned in their seats to look at Dave, who seemed embarrassed by the attention, but grateful for Susan's gesture of support. The businessman, who had been typing aggressively on his laptop 2 rows up, looked over with new interest. The woman across the aisle pulled out her phone to discreetly take a photo, her eyes wide with recognition. Richard Thompson's head snapped up from his laptop screen, his face cycling rapidly through confusion, recognition, and dawning horror. The folk singer he had dismissed so cruelly was one of the most respected musicians of the past 3 decades. Worse yet, everyone in the cabin had now heard Susan's description of why Dave was traveling, making Richard's earlier behavior appear even more heartless in retrospect. The weight of his mistake began settling over Richard like a physical presence. He had publicly humiliated a rock legend who was rushing to fulfill a dying friend's final wish. Every passenger in first class was now looking between him and Dave, clearly remembering his harsh words and cruel dismissal of Dave's explanation. The shame was overwhelming and very public. Other passengers began approaching Dave with quiet words of support and condolences for his friend's condition. A woman from 2 rows back shared that she had lost her best friend to cancer the previous year and understood the urgency of final goodbyes. A businessman offered to help facilitate any connections Dave might need in Los Angeles. The outpouring of sympathy highlighted the contrast with Richard's earlier cruelty. Dave accepted the condolences graciously, while still seeming uncomfortable with the attention. "Marcus would get a kick out of all this," he said with a sad smile. "He always said I took myself too seriously. He'd probably tell me to play the song right here on the plane, just to make everyone uncomfortable." The comment drew gentle laughter from nearby passengers and revealed Dave's ability to find lightness even in grief. Richard sat frozen in his seat, but paralyzed by the magnitude of his social misstep. Every instinct told him to apologize, but his pride warred with his embarrassment. He had built his professional success on projecting confidence and authority, and admitting such a significant error felt like acknowledging weakness. Yet the alternative was sitting in his mistake for the remainder of the flight, knowing everyone saw him as heartless. Susan returned to Dave's seat with a small speaker from the cabin's emergency supplies. "If you'd like to practice your song," she said quietly, "I think everyone would be honored to hear it. Sometimes music helps with grief, both for the person playing and the people listening." Her suggestion was gentle, giving Dave the option without pressure, while also offering him support in preparing for his performance with Marcus. Dave looked around the cabin at the faces of his fellow passengers, seeing encouragement rather than expectation. These were strangers who had been moved by his story and wanted to help him honor his friend in whatever way they could. The gesture touched him deeply, reminding him that kindness often emerged in unexpected places and situations. "Marcus always said music was meant to be shared," Dave said, carefully removing his guitar from its case once again. "He'd probably haunt me if I didn't take advantage of a captive audience." The joke was gentle and self-deprecating, easing the emotional tension while acknowledging the unique circumstances of their impromptu concert at 30,000 feet. As Dave began to play the opening chords of Echoes of Tomorrow, the cabin fell into respectful silence. The song was hauntingly beautiful, with lyrics about friendship, memory, and the way certain moments echo through our entire lives. His voice carried the weight of 25 years of friendship and the knowledge that he was preparing to say goodbye to someone who had shaped his artistic journey. Richard listened to the song with growing awareness of what he had almost prevented. The melody was intricate and emotional, clearly the work of someone with serious musical talent and deep personal investment in the performance. Every note Dave played was a testament to his dedication to his dying friend, making Richard's earlier interruption seem even more callous and misguided. The lyrics spoke of shared dreams, late-night conversations, and the bonds that survive even when people take different paths in life. As Dave sang about echoes of tomorrow, carrying voices from yesterday, several passengers wiped away tears. The song was clearly autobiographical, a musical love letter to a friendship that had endured through decades of change and challenge. When the song ended, the cabin erupted in quiet but heartfelt applause. Dave looked genuinely moved by the response, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Marcus wrote the second verse," he said softly. "He always was the better lyricist. I just made noise while he found the words." The tribute to his friend's contribution revealed the collaborative nature of their relationship and Dave's generous spirit. Susan approached Dave again, this time with tears in her own eyes. "That was beautiful," she said quietly. "Your friend is lucky to have someone who loves him enough to cross the country to play him a song." Her words seemed to capture what everyone in the cabin was feeling, a mixture of sadness for Marcus and admiration for the friendship that Dave was honoring. Richard Thompson finally stood up from his seat, his legs unsteady from nerves and shame. He had been wrestling with his conscience throughout Dave's performance, knowing that he needed to apologize but terrified of the public nature of the necessary conversation. Every moment he delayed made the eventual apology more difficult, but also more necessary. "Mr. Grohl," Richard said, his voice carrying across the now quiet cabin. Every passenger turned to watch the interaction, knowing this was the man who had been so cruel earlier. "I owe you an apology. I was completely out of line earlier, and I'm deeply sorry for my behavior." His words were formal but seemed genuine, delivered with the stiffness of someone unaccustomed to admitting mistakes. Dave looked up at Richard with surprise, clearly not expecting the public apology. "It's okay," Dave said simply. "You didn't know the situation." His gracious response was immediate and without condition, demonstrating the same character that had allowed him to respond with patience to Richard's original cruelty. The contrast between their personalities was stark and obvious to everyone watching. "No, it's not okay," Richard continued, his voice gaining strength as he committed to the apology. "Even if you weren't who you are, even if your friend wasn't dying, I had no right to speak to you that way. I was rude and heartless, and I'm ashamed of my behavior." His acknowledgement went beyond mere celebrity recognition to address the fundamental human decency he had violated. The apology seemed to surprise other passengers as much as it did Dave. Richard's willingness to publicly acknowledge his mistake and take full responsibility demonstrated character that his earlier behavior had concealed. Susan watched the interaction with interest, recognizing the courage it took for someone to make such a public admission of wrongdoing. "I appreciate that," Dave replied, extending his hand to Richard. "We all have bad moments. The important thing is recognizing when we need to do better." His handshake was firm and his forgiveness genuine, creating a moment of reconciliation that elevated everyone in the cabin. The gesture demonstrated grace under pressure and the power of forgiveness to transform difficult situations. Richard shook Dave's hand gratefully, feeling the weight of his shame beginning to lift slightly. "Is there anything I can do to help with your situation in Los Angeles?" he asked. "I have connections in the medical community there, and if your friend needs anything." The offer was tentative but sincere, representing Richard's desire to make amends through action rather than just words. Dave was clearly touched by the offer. "That's very kind of you," he said. "Marcus is in hospice care, so it's really just about spending time with him now. But I appreciate the thought." The gentle decline of Richard's help came with obvious gratitude for the gesture, showing that Dave recognized the sincerity behind the offer, even though assistance wasn't needed. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin had completely transformed. What had started with conflict and cruelty had evolved into understanding and mutual respect. Passengers chatted quietly about the experience, many commenting on how Dave's grace in the face of insult had been as impressive as his musical talent. Richard found himself in conversation with the passenger beside him about the importance of empathy and the danger of making assumptions about others. "I learned something about myself today that I didn't like," he admitted quietly. "But maybe that's how growth happens, through uncomfortable moments that force us to confront our own behavior." Susan approached Dave one final time as they prepared for landing. "I hope everything goes well with your friend," she said softly. "And thank you for sharing that song with us. It was a privilege to hear it." Dave smiled and thanked her for her kindness throughout the flight, acknowledging that her support had made a difficult journey more bearable. As passengers began gathering their belongings for departure, Richard approached Dave once more. "I know I already apologized," he said quietly, "but I wanted you to know that your response to my behavior today taught me something important. You could have embarrassed me or gotten angry, but you chose grace instead. That's a lesson I won't forget." Dave accepted the thanks with his characteristic humility. "Everyone deserves grace," he said simply. "Besides, Marcus always said that how we treat people in difficult moments reveals who we really are. I'd rather be remembered for kindness than anger." His philosophy seemed to encapsulate the difference between his approach to conflict and the one Richard had initially taken. As they deplaned, several passengers approached Dave to wish him well with Marcus and to thank him for the impromptu performance. The song had touched them all, creating a shared experience that transformed a routine flight into something memorable and meaningful. The power of music to connect strangers had been demonstrated once again, even in the confined space of an aircraft cabin. Richard lingered near the gate after deplaning, watching Dave gather his guitar and prepare to rush to his friend's bedside. The contrast between Dave's urgent purpose and Richard's routine business travel highlighted the different priorities that had shaped their interaction. Richard's quarterly reports suddenly seemed trivial compared to Dave's mission of love and friendship. In the days that followed, Richard found himself thinking frequently about the flight and the lessons it had taught him about judgment, empathy, and the importance of understanding context before reacting. He began making small changes in how he interacted with service workers, fellow travelers, and even his own employees, trying to apply the grace that Dave had shown him. Dave made it to Marcus's bedside with hours to spare, and their final conversation was filled with laughter, tears, and music. When Dave played Echoes of Tomorrow for Marcus one last time, his friend smiled and said it sounded exactly like it had 25 years ago, when they still believed they could conquer the world with 3 chords and the truth. Marcus passed away peacefully 2 days later, surrounded by the people who loved him most. Dave spoke at his funeral about friendship, music, and the echoes that good people leave behind in the lives they touch. The airplane performance of their song had been a rehearsal for this final tribute, and Dave played it with all the love and memory it deserved. Richard sent flowers to Marcus's funeral with a note explaining what Dave's grace had meant to a stranger on an airplane. The gesture surprised Dave, who recognized the sincerity behind it and the growth it represented. Sometimes the most unexpected people learn the most important lessons, often from moments they initially wish they could forget. Susan received a commendation from the airline for her handling of the situation, though she insisted that Dave's character had made her job easy. Her willingness to recognize human need and facilitate connection had turned a potential conflict into a moment of beauty and reconciliation that none of the passengers would ever forget. The story of the flight spread quietly through Dave's circle of friends and fellow musicians, becoming a testament to his character and his approach to both fame and adversity. Those who knew him weren't surprised by his gracious response to insult, but they were moved by his commitment to honoring Marcus even in difficult circumstances. For Richard, the experience became a turning point in his personal and professional relationships. He began incorporating empathy and curiosity into his interactions, asking questions before making judgments and offering grace before demanding satisfaction. His colleagues noticed the change, and his business relationships improved as a result of his newfound emotional intelligence. The song Echoes of Tomorrow was never officially recorded or released, remaining a private tribute to a friendship that had shaped both Dave and Marcus in immeasurable ways. Sometimes the most important music never reaches the public, existing only in the hearts of those who need it most, and the memories of those privileged to witness its performance. Dave kept Marcus's guitar pick in his wallet, a small reminder of their friendship and the importance of being present for the people we love. The airplane performance had been preparation for their final goodbye, but it had also demonstrated the power of music to heal, connect, and transform even the most unlikely situations and relationships. Richard's transformation wasn't immediate or complete, but it was genuine and lasting. He began volunteering at a local hospice, inspired by Dave's dedication to Marcus during his final days. The work taught him about courage, grace, and the privilege of being present during life's most sacred moments, lessons that began with an apology on an airplane. The flight attendants who worked that route often shared the story during training sessions about customer service and conflict resolution. Susan's approach to recognizing and supporting passenger needs became a model for handling difficult situations with both professionalism and humanity, while Richard's transformation demonstrated the power of sincere apology and changed behavior. Years later, when Dave was asked about memorable fan encounters or difficult moments in his career, he rarely mentioned the airplane incident. Instead, he talked about Marcus, their friendship, and the importance of being present for the people who matter most. The conflict with Richard had been forgiven and largely forgotten, overshadowed by the deeper purpose of the journey. Richard, however, often shared the story as an example of personal growth and the danger of making assumptions about others. He credited Dave's gracious response with teaching him about true leadership and character, qualities that had transformed not only his business approach, but his understanding of what it means to treat people with dignity and respect. The phrase, "Echoes of Tomorrow," became something of a personal motto for both men in the years that followed, Richard using it to remind himself that his actions today would influence his relationships tomorrow, and Dave finding in it a connection to Marcus that transcended death and time. Susan eventually left the airline industry to become a grief counselor, inspired by the experience of witnessing Dave's journey to say goodbye to Marcus. Her ability to recognize pain and offer appropriate support had revealed a calling she hadn't previously recognized, leading her toward work that felt more meaningful than any customer service position could provide. The other passengers from that flight occasionally shared their own versions of the story, each emphasizing different aspects of what they had witnessed. Some focused on Dave's musical talent, others on his gracious character, and many on the transformation they had seen in Richard. All agreed that they had witnessed something special about human nature and reconciliation. Dave's approach to the incident became part of his legend among fans and fellow musicians alike, not because he had been insulted and forgiven his insulter, but because he had remained focused on what truly mattered, getting to Marcus in time to honor their friendship with music. His priorities had remained clear, even when challenged by cruelty and distraction. The acoustic guitar Dave had carried on that flight became his primary instrument for intimate performances and private moments. He often thought of Marcus when he played it, remembering not just their final goodbye, but all the years of friendship that had led to that moment. The airplane performance had been one of its most important concerts, even though only a few dozen people heard it. Richard's business success continued, but it was now tempered by a deeper understanding of what truly mattered in professional and personal relationships. His employees noticed his increased patience and willingness to listen, while his clients appreciated his more thoughtful approach to problem-solving and conflict resolution. The connection between Dave and Richard didn't develop into friendship, but it remained a meaningful touchstone for both men. They exchanged holiday cards for several years, brief notes that acknowledged the growth that had come from their difficult first meeting and the lessons they had learned from each other's responses to conflict. Marcus's widow, Elena, later told Dave that she had heard about the airplane performance from one of the passengers who had looked up Marcus's obituary online. He would have loved knowing that his song brought out both the worst and best in people on the same flight, she said with a laugh. That's exactly the kind of complicated situation he would have found hilarious and meaningful. The story became part of the informal curriculum at the business school where Richard had earned his MBA, used as a case study in leadership, emotional intelligence, and the importance of context in professional interactions. Students were challenged to consider how their assumptions about others might affect their behavior and decision-making in high-pressure situations. Dave never publicly shared the details of the flight incident, maintaining his focus on Marcus's memory and the importance of their friendship, rather than dwelling on the conflict that had briefly overshadowed his journey. His discretion was characteristic of his approach to both fame and personal relationships, emphasizing substance over drama. The airline eventually implemented new policies about passengers traveling to medical emergencies or funerals, partly inspired by Susan's handling of Dave's situation. Flight attendants received additional training in recognizing and supporting passengers dealing with grief, loss, and time-sensitive personal crises, creating more compassionate responses to human need. Richard's transformation became a source of inspiration for his own family, particularly his teenage children, who had watched their father struggle with anger and impatience for years. Seeing him learn empathy and grace in his 50s taught them that personal growth was possible at any age and that mistakes could become opportunities for positive change. The music industry professionals who knew Dave weren't surprised by his gracious response to insult, but they were moved by the story of his dedication to Marcus. The incident became another example of why Dave was respected, not just for his talent, but for his character, reinforcing his reputation as someone who understood the true purpose of fame and influence. Susan's decision to make the announcement about Dave had been spontaneous, motivated by her recognition of injustice and her desire to support someone dealing with grief. Years later, she still considered it one of the best decisions of her career, a moment when she chose to use her position to facilitate understanding and connection rather than merely maintaining order. The passengers who witnessed the flight's dramatic arc from conflict to reconciliation often said it had changed their own approach to travel and interaction with strangers. Several reported being more patient with service workers, more curious about their fellow passengers' stories, and more willing to offer grace when conflicts arose in their own lives. Dave's performance of Echoes of Tomorrow on that flight remained one of the most intimate and meaningful concerts of his career, even though it had been unplanned and unrehearsed. The song had served its purpose, preparing him to honor Marcus with the dignity and love their friendship deserved, while also demonstrating the power of music to transform hearts and situations. But the most unexpected consequence of that flight came 2 years later, when Richard Thompson was diagnosed with cancer himself. Remembering Dave's grace during his own difficult journey, Richard reached out to apologize once more and to thank Dave for modeling how to handle crisis with dignity. Dave's response was immediate and supportive, offering to connect Richard with the best medical resources available. Dave's willingness to help the man who had once insulted him demonstrated the depth of forgiveness and the transformative power of grace. Richard was overwhelmed by the gesture, recognizing that Dave's kindness came not from obligation, but from genuine care for another human being facing mortality. The role reversal highlighted how much both men had grown since their first meeting. During Richard's treatment, Dave sent him a recording of Echoes of Tomorrow, along with a note explaining that Marcus had always believed music could heal more than just emotional wounds. The song that had been meant as a final gift to a dying friend became a source of hope for someone fighting to live, demonstrating how love and art could transcend their original purposes. Richard survived his cancer treatment, crediting not just medical intervention but also the spiritual and emotional support he had received from unexpected sources. Dave's example of grace under pressure had taught him how to face his own crisis with dignity, while their renewed connection provided encouragement during the darkest moments of his battle. The experience of receiving help from someone he had wronged changed Richard's understanding of forgiveness and redemption. He began speaking publicly about his transformation, using his business platform to encourage empathy and emotional intelligence in corporate environments. His story became a powerful example of how personal growth could emerge from the most unlikely encounters. Dave's continued support during Richard's illness was quiet and practical, connecting him with medical experts and offering encouragement without seeking recognition or credit. His approach demonstrated that true grace wasn't just about forgiving past wrongs, but about actively supporting others through present challenges, regardless of their history. The friendship that developed between Dave and Richard was unlikely but genuine, built on shared experiences of loss, growth, and mutual respect. They discovered common interests beyond their initial airplane encounter, finding connection in their love of music, their commitment to family, and their understanding of life's fragility and preciousness. Marcus's song continued to echo through both men's lives, reminding them of friendship's endurance and the importance of being present for others during critical moments. What had begun as a tribute to one relationship had become the foundation for another, proving that love and music could create connections across the most unlikely circumstances. Susan occasionally heard updates about both men through airline industry networks, learning about Richard's recovery and Dave's continued success. She took quiet satisfaction in knowing that her decision to make an announcement on that long-ago flight had contributed to outcomes she never could have imagined, demonstrating how small acts of courage could have far-reaching consequences. The story of their flight became part of Dave's understanding of how everyday encounters could carry profound significance. He began paying closer attention to the people around him during travel, more aware of the struggles and stories that fellow passengers might be carrying invisibly. His experience with Richard had heightened his sensitivity to human need and opportunity. Richard's business continued to thrive, but his approach to leadership reflected the lessons learned from both his mistake and his recovery. He became known for his ability to recognize and develop emotional intelligence in his employees, creating a corporate culture that valued empathy alongside productivity. His transformation had professional as well as personal benefits. The acoustic guitar that had traveled with Dave to see Marcus became a symbol of the connections that music could create and sustain. He played it at Marcus's memorial service, during Richard's recovery celebration, and in countless private moments when he needed to remember the power of friendship and forgiveness to transform ordinary moments into extraordinary ones. Years later, when Dave was asked about the most important lessons he had learned from his career, he often mentioned the airplane incident as an example of how grace could transform enemies into friends. His willingness to forgive Richard's cruelty had created a relationship that enriched both their lives, proving that our responses to conflict often matter more than the conflicts themselves. Richard established a scholarship fund in Marcus's name, supporting young musicians from disadvantaged backgrounds who showed promise but lacked resources. The fund was his way of honoring not just Marcus's memory, but also the chain of connections that had begun with his own mistake and Dave's gracious response. Music education became his unexpected passion and legacy. The song Echoes of Tomorrow was finally recorded professionally as part of a tribute album to Marcus, with proceeds supporting cancer research and music therapy programs. Dave's performance was accompanied by testimonials from Richard and others whose lives had been touched by Marcus's story and the lessons it taught about friendship, forgiveness, and the healing power of music. Dave and Richard's friendship became a quiet example of transformation and redemption within their respective circles. Neither man publicized their relationship, but those who knew them recognized the depth of change that had occurred in both their lives. Richard's humility and Dave's grace had created something beautiful from something that had begun with cruelty and misunderstanding. The flight attendants who had worked that memorable flight often used the story in training sessions about customer service excellence and conflict resolution. Susan's recognition of Dave's pain and her willingness to facilitate his musical tribute had turned a potential disaster into a moment of healing for everyone involved, demonstrating the power of empathy in professional settings. Richard's approach to business negotiations changed dramatically after his experience with Dave, emphasizing collaboration over confrontation and seeking to understand others' perspectives before asserting his own. His colleagues noticed the difference, and his reputation evolved from that of a demanding executive to a thoughtful leader who brought out the best in others. The passengers from that flight occasionally reconnected through social media, sharing updates about how the experience had influenced their own approaches to conflict and forgiveness. Many reported being more patient with difficult people, more curious about others' circumstances, and more willing to offer grace when faced with behavior they didn't initially understand. Dave's continued success in music was now measured not just by album sales and concert attendance, but by the relationships he had built and maintained through both triumph and tragedy. His friendship with Richard became proof that his character extended beyond his public persona, demonstrating authentic grace that transformed lives in private as well as public moments. The story of Marcus, Dave, and Richard became a case study in music therapy programs, illustrating how songs could serve multiple healing purposes, honoring friendship, facilitating forgiveness, and creating new connections across seemingly insurmountable differences. The airplane performance had been therapy for everyone involved, though none of them had recognized it at the time. Richard's recovery from cancer was celebrated not just by his family, but by the unlikely extended community that had grown from that airplane encounter. Dave performed at Richard's recovery party, playing Echoes of Tomorrow once more as a celebration of life, friendship, and second chances. The song had evolved from farewell to welcome, from ending to beginning. As both men entered their later years, they reflected often on how a moment of conflict on an airplane had become one of the most transformative experiences of their lives. Dave had learned that grace could create unexpected friendships, while Richard had discovered that admitting mistakes could lead to profound personal growth and meaningful connections. Today, the story of their encounter is shared quietly in business schools, music therapy programs, and conflict resolution workshops, as an example of how individual choices can create ripple effects that extend far beyond their original circumstances. Richard's transformation from cruel critic to supportive friend demonstrates that people can change when confronted with authentic grace and given opportunities for redemption. Dave continues to carry Marcus's memory with him through music and friendship, understanding that his friend's legacy lives not just in songs, but in the connections and transformations that grew from honoring their relationship. The airplane performance that was meant as preparation for goodbye became the beginning of new relationships and deeper understanding of forgiveness. Richard's scholarship fund has supported over 200 young musicians, creating opportunities that might never have existed without the chain of events that began with his mistake and Dave's grace. Each scholarship recipient carries forward not just musical education, but the values of second chances, personal growth, and the transformative power of admitting when we're wrong. The acoustic guitar that started the conflict and facilitated the reconciliation remains Dave's preferred instrument for intimate performances and personal moments. Its music has accompanied farewells and celebrations, conflicts and reconciliations, proving that art can serve healing purposes that extend far beyond entertainment or self-expression. Susan's career shift from flight attendant to grief counselor was directly inspired by witnessing Dave's journey to say goodbye to Marcus and Richard's transformation through acknowledgement of his mistakes. Her work helping families navigate loss and reconciliation can be traced back to that moment when she chose to recognize pain and facilitate connection at 30,000 feet. The lessons learned on that flight about judgment, grace, transformation, and the power of music to heal and connect continue to influence everyone who was touched by the experience. What began as a businessman's cruel dismissal of a grieving friend's final tribute became a testament to the possibility of redemption and the importance of responding to conflict with curiosity rather than condemnation. Have you ever made assumptions about someone that proved completely wrong? Have you experienced the transformative power of receiving grace when you expected judgment? Richard Thompson's cruel dismissal of Dave Grohl's musical tribute and the unexpected friendship that grew from Dave's gracious response reminds us that our worst moments can become opportunities for growth when met with authentic forgiveness, and that true character is revealed not in our mistakes, but in how we respond to others' mistakes with grace. Like, subscribe, and share if you believe in the power of second chances and the courage to admit when we're wrong.